So glad to finally have once again here in studio what is a top tier scholar on critical social theory and all the other fallouts of cultural Marxism and its history and how we got to where we are today. It's Dr. Jennifer Miller. Friend, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, you bet. You bet. Let's start here. You're so humble, and I said it last time. I'm going to say it this time because it's one of my favorite stories. When you came up to me the first time in a group, it wasn't just me. We were there at the first Madison County School Board meeting at the elementary school there, and everybody's, getting ready to try to stop the COVID protocols. You had your list of papers and all this research, and you were so squared away. Within a minute of talking with you, I had no clue who you were. I certainly didn't know you were a PhD. I did say when you walked away, wow, I'm glad she's here on our side. And so your humility there, because it took, I don't even know how long of those meetings and talking to you before it ever came up, what you did and your degrees and all that. And so your humility is a major part of why you've been successful, I believe. But at the same time, you earned it. And so let's start with your credentials and your education and how you got to the spot you're in.
Sure. So I have a master's degree in clinical psychology with an emphasis in marriage and family therapy from Pepperdine University. And I've been a licensed professional counselor. This is my 20 years now. I've been doing it for 20 years. And I also have a seminary degree, so I've been doing ministry for quite a while as well. And I have a PhD in general psychology, and I have been in academia. This summer will be 10 years.
10 years.
So I have a unique both experience as well as skill set, because a lot of people in academia do not have field experience. And they don't have clinical experience. And I actually have more clinical experience than I do teaching experience. And so I definitely bring a different approach and a unique ability to kind of bridge the gap between the elites in their ivory towers, up in academia, who never actually get their hands dirty, who come up with all these theories that may or may not apply to real world. And then I definitely am in the trenches with the people who are actually trying to apply this stuff and help people, and try to communicate back to academia, what isn't working. So, being able to kind of bridge that gap has really served me well. And I think that's something I definitely contribute to the cause.
It's so funny so in the field of academia, not just in psychology and what the work you do at academics on that side of the things. So the chasm between what works in reality and what functions out there in the real world and what happens on paper or in a classroom, that chasm is so broad in every other field of expertise. I mean, think of the Marxist and Keynesian economics professors that have never run a lemonade stand. I guess it's across the board. It's so interesting. These people that are teaching these higher forms of education in these different fields, they don't have any real world experience. It can't work.
Right. And I actually when I was going through my PhD program, I had to write a paper, and one of the therapies I use, rational emotive behavioral therapy, is what I chose as the theory I was going to use for the assignment. She returned it to me and told me I had to rewrite it because REBT is not a quote unquote pure theory. And I went back and I said, "What are you talking about?" She goes, "That's a therapy." Right. And I'm like, therapy is theory and practice. And she wouldn't accept it because she wanted something that was just pure theory. Sure. And I went, well, then what's the point in that? Like, I just don't understand what the point is if it's just pure theory and we have no application.
I knew this would go so be appropriate for what's happening in my life. That matches just what we were talking about before we came on the air. What we're learning in the classrooms is to check off a whole bunch of lists of propositions or truth statements. By the way, no wonder we're not advancing like they say, because it probably had to be approved by some scholar from some textbook on the way back that this lady was looking at. But there's no really no transformation power in it. There's no perspectival knowledge in it, which is deeper. And there's certainly no procedural or participatory knowledge in it because it doesn't apply to the real world. And when you bring that to the field of academics, they simply don't understand it because this is a fake reality.
Right. And they tell you that you messed up their theory. So when you go back to them, you say, we tried this and it didn't work. And think about it. Your Marxism is a perfect example, because when we go back to Marxists and say it doesn't work, they tell us that we haven't applied the theory right. We messed up the application of their theory. And it's like, it's been applied over and over and over. It always messes up. There's something wrong with the theory, and they won't accept that.
Yeah, they have found a way, and by the way, this happens in other types of cults
Yes.
and things that you'll study. They falsify their theology, or unfalsify their theology, mainly by saying whatever you say is wrong with it in the real world. They say, well, it hadn't been applied right, so they make it unfalsifiable. I think that's the best way to say it. So Marxism, and that's I very particularly chose that word theology, because I know you're right tracking with this. It is a faith. It is a worldview, just like other cults would be. And they are adhering to it with a rather aggressive and remarkable kind of faith. That's why those with faith in God Almighty better start gearing up and matching their intensity.
Right. Yeah. And just to point out a difference too with Christianity, that when you actually study creation and you actually observe the world, it continues to reinforce and prove that what the Bible says is true. Whereas you have these other cults, including Marxism, where you bring all this evidence that actually contradicts it, and you may wake some of them up, but the hardcore ones, it's like they lock it down and they continue to deny reality in order to stay true and committed to their ideology. And it almost becomes a form of psychosis.
Yeah. And that's what science is, right? And that's why I love all of the apologetics on the side of creation, even though there's some different. We're all going to disagree on a lot because it's just looking back into the past. We have the historical document, but everything from the creation science side, for the most part, and the apologetic sides, when you make a statement, it's testable.
Yes.
And so that would be the same thing that you see with any collectivist ideology or theology in this case, which Marxism is. When you continue to show that it's not provable, it's not repeatable, you can't test it, then that should really discredit it as it is. But the agenda being what it is, we know why it continues to prevail. Yep. Let's start, because you had a great idea. I was kind of thinking, let's talk to our teachers, because we have some friends in Madison County that want to remain anonymous. We have teachers abroad. You've already done some symposium and things that have been very successful. If they reach out to me, several and numerous people I talked to in person, several people by email, they said, can you get Dr. Jennifer Miller on? We want to know how to be in the public school arena, or, by the way, the private arena, or in your church or in a seminary, wherever we are, your corporate world. And we hear all of this diversity and inclusion. We hear critical social theory. We identify it. We don't want to propagate it. We want to fight it from the inside. I don't want to quit yet. It's not time to quit. I'm not in a situation to quit. So I was initially thinking, let's set up and let's build this out and start talking, because you've successfully fought this from the inside for a long time. And I had it completely reversed. You walked in and said, no, let's set up the history of this, in particular, starting with what I've studied to be maybe the most successful form of how we got to where we are today, coming from the Fabian socialists. Let's set up the history of how this worked and entered academia and how we got to where we are. And then let's talk in the second hour, or as we progress through this, on how to fight this from the inside the right way. So let's start there, kind of at the beginning of what we have to draw a line somewhere. And I reached out to you and I said, let's start with the Fabian socialists and kind of your idea of what they are and how they were so successful versus some of the other communist movements and things like that. Let's go.
Well, when everything changed for Marxism was after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, because Marx had a certain set of predictions about how things would roll out. And the first communist revolution that we saw was in Russia, and it actually contradicted every single prediction that Marx proposed. Now, we know that Lenin's approach ended up inspiring the revolutions that we saw in China and in Cuba, and that is definitely the violent revolutionary wing of an approach of instating communism. But the European Marxists were so elite that they didn't want to engage in a violent approach, but also they were left reeling. So like I said, when you have an ideology that's disproven, you either reject it it, or you reject reality and instead dig in. And that's what these European Marxists did. And so what you ended up having was, in Britain, you had a group that called themselves the Fabian Society. And this is happening concurrently with the fascists that were forming over in Italy and then moving into Germany. So they're kind of happening concurrently. And with the Fabian Society specifically, it was made up of eugenicists as well as Malthusians. And so Malthusian is the theory that we have to manage population because we're going to run out of food.
Okay.
So
I hear Jay Dyer all the time. Do you ever listen to Jay Dyer? Or do you? Okay. I hear him all the time talking about a Malthusian. So he's the one that's shown me. I'm reading right now Dr. Carol Quigley's The Anglo-American Establishment, where he's really focusing in on this kind of 1900-ish Cecil Rhodes first group, and Lord Milner, Alfred Milner there kind of building his group together, and then how they kind of merged and accepted a lot of the Fabian socialism stuff. So thank you for identifying what the Malthusian idea or kind of doctrine is. Do you know why is it named Malthusianism?
That's the name of the man who came up with the theory.
Okay. It makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So his idea is he has accepted this deal that because we know resources and energy and things are finite, instead of decentralized power and individual, local farms and local decision making, like we know is the best option for man based on trial, he's accepted the social engineering idea as a must in order to keep the earth moving forward.
Absolutely. And so
interesting.
And it really aligns, and honestly, I think it undergirds the Davos Great Reset, the WEF, because it's all about scientifically managed population control. And that's part of the ideology that founded the Fabian Society, was these Malthusians, these eugenicists, who wanted to usher in Marxism, but they really wanted to do it opposite of Lenin. So instead of coming in forcefully with a military approach, they decided to play the long game. And they took the name Fabian after the Roman general Fabius Maximus, whose strategies were patience and slow attrition. So the original Fabians said we wanted a peaceful, subtle, deadly long game. And when we hear the phrase, the long march through the institutions, that's their primary strategy. It is about permeation into all facets of society.
Sure. Reiterate one more time who the Fabian was. He was like a Roman general. An aggressive Roman general, but an aggressive meaning he was full on with the idea of expansion of the empire, but he wasn't just a run in, burn it all down type guy. He knew he could be more successful through a more patient attack or maybe a siege or maybe trying to win some hearts and minds of this group. It's a whole patient strategy that they named themselves after this very person.
Absolutely. And he had no problem cutting off supply chains and then just sitting there while the people starved.
Right.
He was patient.
We're finding, and then, so now the connections abound between what we'll see on a war on food, a slow war on food to control people and everything like that. We're going to go to break here, but let's round this off once again before we leave Malthusianism. And this will be prevalent from this point forward now that I know what it is.
Yes.
You could walk out of here right now, Dr. Jennifer Miller. I like calling you Dr. J for short. And I would have a foundation to build the rest of my year on. Okay. And, but we're not. This Malthusianism is incredible. It's kind of one of our first modern ideas of social engineering being a must.
Yes. Right.
And so that's also brings in the word, technocracy was how they were going to do it. Since we have to socially engineer these things, these people are assuming there is scientific algorithms and we can because science becomes their God in many ways. Science will be the answer that we can control these people. And many of these people, while their ideology and worldview results in very evil things, there's a group of these people that really thought they were doing what's best for the world.
Absolutely.
A lot of these people bought into it to the point where they said, this is a must for humanity to go forward and even take the next step and evolve. And so that's what's interesting, is determining, and we don't have to, but determining who is just straight up evil and wanting to control people versus who is bought into this new religion of Malthusianism and says it's the only way forward.
Absolutely. And that's the problem, is they are a Trojan horse, and intentionally so. They embraced the imagery of a Trojan horse, and they intentionally attract public support using buzzwords that are all illusions. They're not reality.
And which is why when you go to, say, the UN Agenda 2030 and you read it, or the World Economic Forum, if you're not schooled like us in being able to translate what's going on, they can make it sound great.
Yes.
Because very many of them, and they always can revert to their good intentions as a way to justify the ill processes and the results that come from this worldview. There you go. We're off and running. And I'm so thankful. It's Dr. Jennifer Miller here in studio. We're going to make sure by the end of this, you'll have some type of email that you'd want to give out. Is that right? Where
sure.
people can contact. Let's do it right now on this end in case people have to leave. Well, how could people reach out to you just to make a connection and maybe, grow this network, and maybe to have specific questions that you can help them with?
So they can go to my website, Jennifer Miller Ministries, so plural.com. And in there they can find contact information as well as that seminar that you referenced there that was recorded. And so if people wanted to go back and rewatch it, they can find that on my website as well. JenniferMillerMinistries.com. We're here for the next 2 hours. Send a link out, WYAB.com. You can stream it, click listen, the TuneIn app, or just on 103.9 WYAB. Tell everybody you know about the show. It's not revenge we're after. It's the reckoning. And you can bet the reckoning is on its way. You're in a good fight with Jameson Haygood live here from the Mac Haik of Flowood studios. And we have Dr. Jennifer Miller here in studio to talk about the history of Fabian socialism, how it plays out into our world today, how we got to where we are here. And then in particular, as we progress through this 2 hours, we're going to be talking about how to fight this stuff from inside your corporations and inside your churches, inside wherever you exist in your sphere of influence. Jennifer, let's pick right back up. Well, just one more time. This Malthusian idea is the idea that we have to social engineer to the planet and people and food and energy and everything, because if we don't centralize power around it, then it's not going to be sustainable. And then from that falls out this new bunch of Europeans that accept that worldview, but they saw how Lenin's form of communism and force didn't work. And so they come up with this idea, the long march through the institutions to capture these powerful institutions. Let's pick up right there. Absolutely. And I actually want to share a quote that I found from a journalist. His name was John T. Flynn. At the time, he is one of the few that would actually openly oppose FDR.
Okay.
And he is also the first journalist that wrote about how the U.S. government had advanced knowledge of Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
So yeah. This is that journalist. Sure. He said the line between fascism and Fabian socialism is very thin. Fabian socialism is the dream. Fascism is Fabian socialism plus the inevitable dictator.
Right. Wow.
So they were very, very similar in ideology. The only issues that the Fabian socialists had with the fascists was the nationalism of it.
Okay.
They wanted it to be global.
Right.
So that's why Fabian socialism ended up being the underlying ideology for the globalists, because they liked the fascism ideology, but they didn't like the nationalism of it.
And this fascism being kind of, you already have these corporate institutions that have capital, the monopoly capitalists of the world. So they're wielding this power through the fact that they have resources and they have all this stuff merging with the state.
Yes.
That also has some leverage over the individual. And so when you put those together, you have a really powerful centralized form of
right. And that's what
control.
that's what we're seeing happening here in our country is state capitalism or corporatism, where you get really powerful corporations working in tandem with the government. And we have so many examples of people who would work in government and then leave and go get jobs in these corporations, or vice versa. When a new administration comes in, they hire people off of the boards of these corporations. So that was the strategy of fascism, but also Fabian socialists had the same idea of let's work within capitalism nationalism like a Trojan horse until we get to the point where we have taken it over, but almost like doing it in the open without people realizing what was actually happening.
Yeah, we've talked here on the show about H.G. Wells, and I've not read a bunch of him. I've read snippets, and I've studied people who lecture through him. I don't want to claim to have read something I haven't, but I have enough idea about what he's about to say. He was one of the ones saying, look, you communists and socialists, slow down here. It's going to be the capitalists that build the institutions and the infrastructure through which we take over to build this world government. And just to reiterate what you said, this Fabian socialist movement was always outside of nationalism, looking to build world government, a world communist state, technocratic state.
Absolutely. And H.G. Wells, I found a quote from him where he talked about how he intentionally used Trojan horses in his writings as a, quote, subtle conditioning of the masses that world government was mankind's only salvation.
I've never heard that quote, but I knew he was doing that through a few. The two in particular that I studied lectures through, I had Jay Dyer's the one who lectured through them, and I listened to him. And I want to send you a link for him just to see you guys would, I mean, you could be on his show and he would have, matter of fact, that may be my new goal is to get you on his show. He has two books in particular where he's not hiding anything. He's almost like an apologist or thought leader for this Fabian socialist and Milner type, Alfred Milner type groups, Chatham House, Royal Institute of Eternal Affairs and all this stuff. And one of them is called The Open Conspiracy. The other one's called The New World Order.
Right. Yeah.
So that's where he lays out. It's almost, these are like their textbooks. They're not hiding anything. These are their textbooks of how they're explaining how we're going to build this world government out in the open. So when they call you conspiracy theorists, no, it's just an open conspiracy, like H.G. Wells said.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have other well-known Fabians, George Bernard Shaw. He claimed that the strength of Fabianism is that people don't know what they're doing.
Right. Right.
So
they're building this without ignorantly.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. What I found was interesting was Bertrand Russell.
You're saying all the names that I want to know more about.
Yep. Bertrand Russell, philosopher, social psychologist, at one point was a Fabian socialist. He, I think, ended up changing over to, what's it called? There was another term, guild socialism, which is more labor unions. But at one point he was a Fabian socialist, and he wrote about the importance of mass psychology and its role in the propaganda, or of course they call it the education of the masses. We call it propaganda. And he noted that religion would play a part, but back in the day, he was predicting that the role of media and entertainment would grow in importance in indoctrinating the public. And so no wonder that was one of the first institutions that they targeted the takeover.
When was Bertrand Russell riding around? Do you have an idea?
I'm trying to remember. I didn't write down
somebody was kind of there in the 60s. Was he tied to the Tavistock Institute?
Yeah,
I know we're all talking about the 1900s.
Right. We're all talking about the last half of the last century.
Right. Exactly.
So it's all, but this is building the groundwork for the philosophy, that will drive the people who will then go into the institutions that slowly take it over. And, their whole goal was to go into these institutions and not revolutionize them, but instead go in, learn them, and then slowly take them over. Yeah. So it wasn't about, I'm just going to go in and then all of a sudden blow it up from the inside. It was like, no, I'm going to go in and master it and then turn it into the direction I want it to go. Yeah,
that's so interesting. And I did look up, he's right there. He's born 1872 and died 1970. So he's right in that modernism era, and he's becoming influential right after the Bolshevik Revolution, where they saw all that play out there, and they wanted to know in Europe, how can we take some of those tenets of control but yet use them in a way where, for instance, instead of rushing in with your Russian military to take over the institution and now we run the college. No, you get your degree and you get tenured there at the college.
Exactly.
And start pushing your ideology from there. And in particular, I hear Lord Alfred Milner, who played a major role in this and kind of this transition from Cecil Rhodes's initial plan of roundtable groups and inner secret societies that are looking to build world government. In particular, what he was wanting to do was merge Britain and America again, because he knew they were the two thought leaders of the day. They had so much of the resources and all that. They're always talking about educating the masses, and you just cleared something up for me. We need to be always translating what they mean. They wanted to be in control of this. They weren't really in freeing people through educating. They knew that they had to educate, quote, propagandize the masses would be a major key part of this, to have these, for lack of a better term, useful idiots. Yes. So anytime this bunch is talking about education, because when you read it, if you don't watch it, you think these guys are, meaning well, and some of them may have been, but you got to know what they're saying when they mean educating. Because you think of Europe coming out of that monarchy, so many people were left illiterate. No, they were all saying, no, we need them to read because they're going to need to read our propaganda.
Absolutely. And that is very much the intention. And we're really setting the stage to understand how we ultimately can then talk about what's happening in the education system, because the education system has become an indoctrination system on purpose, because they redefined what being educated means. Being educated now means being woke, which means you are fully indoctrinated into their worldview. That's what it now means to them when they say educated.
That is a perfect way for us to stop right here. Now I got it, because when I was reading Dr. Carroll Quigley's work on the Anglo-American establishment, in particular, he's focusing on that Cecil Rhodes group and what came out of that, and what was known as this Milner Fabian type socialism that branched out from it. One of the things I keep reading is, once again, they're automatically trying to educate these people. In particular, there's a part of it where I'm reading it where making people literate is a good thing. Well, it would be if you're looking to free them. If you're looking to indoctrinate them, now you're back to the same type of evil. We pick up right there with Dr. Jennifer Miller when we get back. And in particular, let's get into that Fabian socialism transition into what is known as the Frankfurt School, where it comes over here in person. Tell everybody you know about the radio show. Dr. Jennifer Miller, now we're over to the point. This Fabian socialist idea sets in that the best way to social engineer, the best thing for society, is for collectivism and control over the energy and resources and everything. But yet we need to do it through taking over the institutions, taking over academia and everything. And then it molds into, because there's a linear line and they all converge, because they're all really similar worldviews. It comes over here through this bunch with the Frankfurt School and Marcuse. Get into that.
Absolutely. So Fabian socialist thinking was the primary force in the development of critical theory by the Frankfurt School. Okay. And the Frankfurt School was formed by Marxists who opposed the Lenin approach. So therefore they embraced the Fabian approach. And we know Marcuse, he specifically came out of Germany, and while he embraced fascism, he opposed not only the nationalism, but of course the anti-Semitic approach, because he himself was Jewish. So he wanted to carry on the academic work of integrating Marxism into academia specifically, and really developed critical theory oriented toward academics and education. So a lot of the educators that were working in the universities and such at the time really glommed on to Marcuse's ideas and trying to rework the approach to education with this mindset of we need to view the world through the lens of the oppressed, and we need to be orienting education in a way that it is for the advantage of the oppressed, so that we can ultimately usher in a new system, right, that removes the oppressors from their state of power.
Where is Marcuse operating out of? Two different places, starting in Frankfurt, Germany, and did he actually move over to the U.S.? Okay.
He ended up, so initially he was at Columbia University as a professor.
Imagine that.
Right. So that's how he started getting his ideas out into the university. But then he took a position over at OSS, which is now the CIA.
I've never this is groundbreaking. I'm getting so pumped up, I'm going to be able to run through a brick wall. Marcuse, is that the best way to say it? Marcuse?
Yep.
Okay. Marcuse came over here started this critical theory stuff at Columbia as far as meshing it with American academia. And then he took a position with the Office of Strategic Services,
yes,
which I do know we all have been following. That was it's the CIA now?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
So you can
who's doing this radio? I hope you don't decide to do FM radio 10 to noon ever, because I'm gone. I'm digging ditches. Continue with that.
Yes.
Wow.
So that's where Marcuse's ideas started to
Sure.
infiltrate academia, but then we can then see where he got his foot in the door with government and starting to take that over. But at the same time that this is happening, there is a significant figure rising up in Brazil. Okay. And he's a Brazilian Marxist, Paulo Freire. And he ends up developing the critical pedagogy or critical education theory. Yeah. So he is intentionally developing an education pedagogy. And this is all happening in the 1960s. And he starts out very poor himself and illiterate and all of that. So his initial position with the Brazilian government was a literacy program.
Okay.
So just what we were talking about, mm-hmm. right? But then there was a coup, and the government of Brazil fell in 1964. He had to flee. He ends up going to Chile. And that's where he writes his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Okay.
And that immediately takes off, gets translated into a bunch of languages. And because of that, he gets invited to come on up to Harvard and take a teaching position.
Wow.
Yes. So Paulo Freire, he is the third most cited scholarly author in all of the humanities and the social sciences. And he intentionally targeted the schools of education because the goal was to indoctrinate a generation of teachers who would then go into schools and then start raising up children who were indoctrinated into this ideology. He intentionally targeted schools of education to train teachers in this pedagogy.
It's a network marketing. I mean, it's genius for
Absolutely.
a network marketing thing. When really we could have been defending way back then. Hindsight 2020. We weren't teaching our teachers to critically think and to understand that seeing everything or dividing people into the oppressor and the oppressed won't work, and seeing people as a collective won't work. While we were just being negligent, they were focusing in on education programs, being the ones that teach the teachers. And this guy is kind of the patron saint of this Paulo Freire.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And he, in his books, even in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, from my understanding, is still used in a lot of the schools of education as material for teachers to learn. But in his book, he does not cite a single reference of any educational scholars or research. Instead, all of his citations are Marx, Lenin, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and Frederick Haygood, and of course, Herbert Marcuse.
Okay, Herbert Marcuse. We got a couple more minutes in this segment. We'll come back for one short segment, and then we'll start our second hour. Where does John Dewey fit into this? Real close around that? I know he's doing the same thing, and this is all I know about him. Mm-hmm. I thought he was kind of one of the ones like this Paulo Freire, wanting to focus in and be the one who was teaching the teachers.
Yes, but Dewey, I believe, was coming from Britain and bringing it. Whereas Paulo Freire, he starts out in Brazil and then is brought into America, and that's where you start to see all these men converge into the American universities, and their ideas start to meld together. Yeah.
And then from that, you see now you have little bitty, as they stamp out each individual little teacher, these people go and spread, then they become a professor. And then of course it works down, and before you know it, you got this accepted in your local hometown public schools.
Yes. And I want to say this real quick. James Lindsay, he claims that the majority of the schools of education were captured by this Freire pedagogy by 1995.
Dr. Jennifer Miller here in studio, back for the final segment of the first hour, a whole nother hour to go. Final short segment here with Dr. Jennifer Miller. Jennifer, if somebody just needed a short, concise definition of critical theory as a whole, where would you start?
Critical theory took Marx and broke it out of economics and social class. Marx's original idea was about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and talking about the haves and the have-nots. What critical theory does is it breaks it out and says, no, it's about power dynamics. And so it's always framed within the dynamics of the oppressed versus the oppressor. And it's applied to our social systems now. Yeah. So that's why we see different flavors or denominations of it within, the extreme feminism, the LGBTQ, all of that stuff where everything is framed within oppressed versus oppressor. That is critical theory.
Focusing on incredible stuff. And I got that on recording now. Focusing on, you said the power structure, another 50-cent psychological word or whatever would be the hegemony.
Yes.
Right. So what centers or what institutions or groups of people seem to have the power, looking at them as a collectivist group and not individuals within the bunch, lumping them all in together and looking at a way to engineer society to make it back right. Let's see here. Absolutely. We have a minute and a half or so.
Well, that was Gramsci's whole focus, and he was one of the founders of the Frankfurt School.
Mm-hmm. Is he out of Italy, or am I not right?
Well, he but he was one of the one of the contributors to the Frankfurt School and the development of the critical theory. And Gramsci opposed cultural hegemony and he specifically wanted to incorporate Fabian socialist the permeation, the slow gradual takeover. So yes, that idea of looking at cultural hegemony and saying where are the pockets of power? How do we permeate and infiltrate so then, like Trojan horses, we can be brought into those institutions and we can go, play along, right, until we're ready to then sneak out and take over.
Yeah. What about the intent for these today, maybe even then, and intent now with 30 seconds? It seems to me, especially when it comes to the different subsects like critical race theory, but maybe all of them, it's not even to really promote equality. I think it's to switch and make the oppressed the oppressor.
That's
they're
absolutely.
Not upset at oppressors. Mm-hmm. They want to be the oppressor.
That's absolutely the goal. And what it is it's a reversal of the oppressed and the oppressor for a period of time in order to quote unquote like equal things out. So basically the oppressed get their turn to be the oppressors. Okay. But that's also intended to break the institution, because remember, the entire goal is to demolish existing institutions and usher in a new system, which is global control.
Today, and we're laying out everything from the original Fabian socialist idea of the long march through the institutions of collectivism and bringing in this socialist model to control the world. And now we've made it all the way into pretty much modern day over to the Frankfurt School, where this stuff started hitting the universities. And in particular, you were talking about the fallout from Paulo Freire.
Yes.
Freire, and how he's really one of the patron saints of this infiltrating the academic world in order to stamp out a bunch of little collectivist, communist, brainwashers, and how effective that's been. Please continue.
Absolutely. So Freire's goal was to capture and transform colleges of education, schools of education, to mold a generation of teachers who would then program every generation of student thereafter to see the world on the side of the oppressed. Mm-hmm. So that's why he wrote the book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He developed critical pedagogy, and because what he believed was that teachers are either teaching students to replicate the current system, which they believe is bad and needs to be overthrown, or you are turning students into change agents, right? Little revolutionaries to then go out into the world and replicate their ideology. So that's why he redefined what education means and really created a Marxist theory of education by incorporating Marcuse's critical theory, but specifically applying it to education. So if you think about it, these professors who are then teaching people to be teachers all the way down to kindergarten, and they are intentionally saying you need to choose a side. Either you're going to be helping to reproduce this evil system that just benefits the oppressed, the oppressors over the oppressed, or you're going to help us usher in, this new system. So you're either reproducing the existing system, or you're creating the conditions for its demise. So
that's interesting, that point that goes on at higher levels of education that we've seen happening here from the mid 1900s on, and ramping up very quickly. Yeah, before they convince these new teachers to go teach people to be opponents of the current institutions that had worked so well, but especially the ones here in America, talking about things that would build like traditional values and the value seen for all in the traditional biblical family, and how, and even though if there's poor people, if you have individual private property rights, you actually have a way to get out of that poverty, and you don't, in order to stamp out people who are going to overthrow the institutions, you have to first totally slander it.
Yes.
And so that was what they were doing with these individual rights in the United States Constitution. I mean, that was a two-part system.
Absolutely. And that's why framing everything in this false dichotomy of oppressor, oppressed, and turning what once were either the heroes or seen as positive contributors to society, like men,
Sure.
right? They started by attacking men and with this radical feminism, and then race, and and now gender and gender identity and all these other things where they have to attack these institutions. But one thing that's interesting, if we go back to
Sure.
Bertrand Russell real quick, because he specifically said the importance of you have to get to the child before they're 10 years old. And he said you have to teach them first and foremost that their home is obstructive. So you turn the child against the parents or against what they're being taught at home so that they value and prioritize what they're being taught in the classroom. And then he said you need to start encouraging the propaganda to get them to, again, view the world through the lens of the oppressed, view it through this critical theory lens, which is ultimately just a Marxist ideology. But it's training them to see it that way so that you can then turn them in, like I said, into little change agents that are going to go out into the world to liberate humanity from this evil, awful system.
And what caused all these problems, say what caused problems for women on the in our society and in our culture, was the strong men, the very thing that was protecting them and
Yes.
propping them up and giving women value. And by the way, the women were giving men value in the created order of things that we've seen. So it start there, and it would start with the ultimate discipline that would have been created in the home there. Mm-hmm. If you can discredit these parents, which not every parent is going to be perfect, but overall we know that the real values in life are being handed off from generation to generation through the parents. You discredit them this way. Now you got a bunch of people that are ready to overthrow the institutions.
Yes. And so when we listen now within education, if you go to school board meetings, if you talk to teachers or principals, you're going to hear these phrases that are all based in this critical education, this critical pedagogy, things like culturally relevant teaching. That's just another word for woke teaching. You'll hear phrases like decolonizing the curriculum.
Yeah.
Democratic classrooms. This is all Freire stuff. Student-led project-based learning, which is the basis of social-emotional learning. Mm-hmm. So social-emotional learning is a key thing. And then, of course, comprehensive sexuality education, which is just the sexual education that promotes LGBT.
Yeah. Incredible. So now we're here where we are. Let's kind of transition into how to fight this stuff. And well, we're working on how to recognize it. Mm-hmm. How to fight this stuff from the inside. Kind of where do you want to start there?
Yes. So what I would say is I've been in academia. I misspoke. I've been in academia since 2010. It's almost 13 years. Mm-hmm. And so I've watched it become more and more prominent as far as talk amongst the faculty, but then you also start to see it show up in the textbooks, which are just written by college professors. Yeah. So you're just seeing it become more and more brazen and more out in the open. And so that's why I wanted to start with these buzzwords and help you to recognize where they're coming from, because they are coming from a completely different worldview. And so it's really going to be an argument of ideology, right? And people who go to college and they think that they're just being educated. I'm just going to be taught how to be a teacher. I'm going to be taught how to teach math, right? Sure. No, you're not being taught how to teach math. If you are going to any of these schools of education that have been taken over by these critical pedagogy, critical theorists, any school of education that is built off of this new model of education, where it becomes the air you're breathing, like it is presumed to be true. So it's one of those unfortunate things where when you go in and you don't realize they're operating from a different premise, And they have even stolen our words and redefined them. And so they're using the same words we are, like education, but they mean it completely different because they're working from a different presupposition.
Yeah, I've heard Leighton Flowers say they work off the same vocabulary but a different dictionary.
Absolutely.
Is exactly what we're doing. So, and this would also be why would you say that a few years ago, the Southern Baptist Church had Resolution 9, you kind of may be familiar with it, where they actually said critical theory, and in particular critical race theory, is a usable tool for analyzing things. It was just a soft way to bring it in and legitimizing it. And what we've been saying back to that is, no, you cannot accept the godless worldview at all because of its very foundations are anti-God, they're anti-human, and they're not in conjunction with reality either.
Yep.
So there's no good analyzing that comes through from these ideas of critical theory, throwing everybody into a bunch of oppressor and oppressed groups.
Right.
It can't be compromised with, in other words.
No. And what's also something I want to point out too is it's based off of a very humanistic worldview where they actually glorify the human being, and they completely negate the idea of us having a fallen, sinful nature. Mm-hmm. So they instead believe that all the issues that a human being has is because of social conditioning. And so if we can strip that away or recondition them, then we can allow them to go back to their naturally good state as well. So how do you have a conversation or engage in dialogue when you're working from such a polar opposite worldview?
Yeah.
Because then when you're talking about goals, it's like, well, if those are goals, but yet we're operating from a different, playbook.
Yeah.
So we're not agreeing in actuality.
Sure. And no wonder why every one of these different lines of thought also want to get rid of the traditional characteristics that only God has as found in his word, which would be really infinite, but we do know a few things about him from his word, and they want to negate all that from the beginning so they can have a blank slate to start from and basically prop man up as his ability to kind of be his own God.
Absolutely. And that's one of the strategies that is working against us. So if you're a teacher, whether you're in, K through 12, or if you're in a college, university setting, one of the things that works against us is we are told we have to bracket our Christian worldview because we have to keep, religion separate, right? And so we're not supposed to bring our faith, our worldview. We have to filter it and neutralize it, right? But they don't have to do that, because they're not identified as a religion. Sure. So they get to go in there and they get to proselytize openly all day long and claim First Amendment rights because they're not identified as a religion. Whereas I, as a Christian, I cannot do the same.
Wow, that is so incredible. So that brings us back to what we did at the very start of this saying this is 100% a theology, and is some of the things we presented at the Madison County School Board, where I say, make no mistake about it. We have a union of church and state here. The difference is their church is this secular humanism, this critical theory, seeing everybody as the oppressor and the oppressed model. Yep. That's such an incredible point. We literally walk into a situation where we get to neutralize our worldview, which is, proven true and profitable for all, even if you don't hold to it, right? Mm-hmm. It's at least profitable for all. This idea that you would leave the 99 for one, and that we have individual value found in being a human being alone, not our socioeconomic status. We have to check all that at the door. Meanwhile, they bring in their worldview and start creating have a revival, like a collectivist revival that
Absolutely.
we pay for.
Yes, absolutely. And it's all in the textbooks. It's all in the curriculum. And this is something that I've been trying to convey at Madison County Schools, the school board and the superintendent, is here's the issue. It's everywhere. It's in the textbook. It's in the curriculum, but it's also going to be in the teachers themselves, where many of them may not even realize it because they went to this university setting where that was the air they breathed. And they had no idea that they were being slowly indoctrinated into this different worldview, because it seems very reasonable. But also when you look around and everybody's agreeing, and of course it's in the textbook. And so it's like, wow, look at this alignment, right? Of this teacher's teaching it and the textbook says it. My peers all go along with it. And it's in class after class after class after class. I mean, it becomes reasonable, but then also it's supported by this very sincere motivation to make things better, and to who wouldn't want women to have equal rights, and who wouldn't want racial minorities to be supported, and look how altruistic and, good our motivations are. And, why can't we try to do things different and see if it helps the most people? And it all seems very sincere and very, but all of that's intentional. In order to, like I said, indoctrinate the masses to support the cause, so that those who are actually driving the Trojan horse can bring about their ultimate ends.
Breaking down these institutions and installing their new rule by science, this technocratic, social engineered, top-down state where the family is no longer relevant and you work where you need to and we control the food and all that incredible stuff. Let's go to break with this one then, because you just laid out a group of people that we could maybe wake up, and this might play into how to exist inside this and sleep at night and not feel that you're contributing to something worse. Because if everybody quits and leaves the seminaries, and if they leave their different churches and they leave education, then we are going to lose, right? So people need to stay here. Let's start with this group that you just said, the ones that don't know they're propagating this worldview of Marxism brought into the social and cultural realm. Those people might be the best people to start with, but you got to be careful with those people, because you're awake, it's poison, but they don't. Let's kind of pick up there. And then I want to just hear your own personal stories of what's been successful for being within the institutions, probably some of the only a few conservative Christian, openly Christian professors, how you functioned inside of the system, and where we can go going forward. We continue with Dr. Jennifer Miller when we get back. It's a Good Fight with Jameson Haygood right here on 103.9 WYAB. We got Dr. Jennifer Miller here in studios, and we're going to be posting this everywhere we can. This is a evergreen rerun from this point forward. She's already said I could rerun it whenever I want to, and now you know why I'm so glad that she is on our side. Let's start here, Jennifer. This person that means well, doesn't know they've been indoctrinated with this cultural Marxism, this critical theory, and they're now a propagator of the meme complex. They're doing it innocently. They're in your work environment. They're the teacher next door. Is there a way to deal with them without doing like I've done in my past and run up and, spill off a whole bunch of facts that they can't track, and then they feel they're demonized and they run off, and I push them further away?
Right. Well, no, what I would say is the approach I would take, honestly, is a very similar approach that missionaries take when they're trying to engage somebody in a different culture who speaks a different language, right?
Great.
You have to go in with grace and understanding that they are coming from a different worldview. So this is more than just spouting facts at them, because they can easily dismiss those things. And instead, what you want to do is demonstrate that you are someone who is reasonable, who is an advocate of truth, who cares about them, that you are not just there to provide this opposing totalitarian approach, right? You don't want to do the same, just under a different banner. And that's been my big thing is I do not want to do what they're doing. I do not want to I want to use the weapons of the warfare that the Lord has given us. I want to use that belt of truth. I want to use, righteousness, meaning I'm doing things in a right way according to how God would have me behave.
And seeing them as a real person.
Exactly.
Because don't let me cut you off, but that was a major part where I was missing. I didn't mean to do it this way, but I learned that in actuality, I was seeing that person as ideological ground to conquer instead of an individual.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's what, when you start talking about the psychology of it, you have this whole psychology about in-group versus out-group.
Yes.
And when you automatically assume, benign intentions and, well-being when it comes to people who are in group, even though that may not be
Great
the case,
point. Sure.
right? But then out group.
They check off my statement of faith. So they may be harming, transformation, my transformation, theirs, the cultures, the church.
Yeah.
Great point. So more than somebody who doesn't even hold to this.
Right. Absolutely. So when you are coming as an out group, right? I am out group. I have a different ideology. I have a different value system. Now, they may not fully see you as out group yet, because if you are a fellow teacher, if there's things in common. So what you don't want to do is reinforce the distinctions in a way where you become solidified as out group, and therefore nothing you say has any value. And in fact, they'll probably start avoiding you or blocking you, right? Because you've just been categorized as out group, and out group is bad, and you have nothing of value. So if you can utilize what commonality that you have, also understand the language and perspective that they're coming from, it can even be helpful to kind of take that language, but then start to demonstrate a different a different way of looking at it. So if when they say educated, they mean a certain thing, you can speak into that knowing where they're thinking, but then starting to ask questions, starting to introduce possible differences, but doing it in a way where it's still kind of that slow permeation, but you're doing it with truth.
So you're collaborating and maybe redefining terms or defining your terms before you go any further. And it also sounds like you are making a goal to have a follow-up conversation. This is another thing that I used to not do, and it was not ill-intended. You don't have to finish everything that day. It's not going to happen anyway. It's not reality. It's not even that 5-minute conversation. If you don't watch it in the rush to try to get as much out of that, as much ground ideologically conquered in 5 minutes, you've cut off the whole next conversation. Oh, by the way, when they start avoiding you in that case, it's not their fault in many times, right?
Right.
It's mine.
Right.
I was awkward. Came across too arrogant, and half the time it probably was because I had the truth.
Yes.
And so this is very, very valuable for relationships in any way. They're not ideological ground to be conquered. And you would want to, if you leave that conversation knowing that it's open for another conversation, that's the only way forward. That's the way for success anyway.
And the way that I see it is almost like how you would approach somebody who, say, is in a cult, right? And you need to gently wake them up. You're not trying to convert them to another cult. You're trying to wake them up so that they start thinking for themselves. They do research for themselves, and they're coming to their own determinations. They're using their mind, to decide rather than just, mindlessly taking what has been given to them and spoon fed to them, through their education and their training. And then again, the confirmation bias that they also get from those who are around them, because when they start to feel that cognitive dissonance, they're going to look to try to reinforce what they believe. And that'll only work for so long, though. So that's why if you are patient and compassionate and understanding, but then also putting a pebble in their shoe is all you're trying to do. Right. Is you're just trying to get them to consider that the ideology that they believed was just locked down 100% true. If you can get them to at least consider that there might be something wrong with it or off about it, or it might not be everything that they were told that it was. Yeah. Put the pebble in their shoe that gets them to be thinking, and then remain a reasonable source. So as they start to allow that cognitive dissonance to wake them up, you become a person that's approachable, that will be understanding and kind and not judge them, but also not be a potential source of just further abuse because a lot of people, it's a very common thing to cult jump, Right, yeah. So we don't want that.
Well, and I love the motivation of that, because I also don't want to be just trying to convert them to my set of propositions, whether it be my political leanings or my axioms that decentralized authority is better than centralized authority. I don't want to convert them to my cult, for lack of a better word,
right.
or my worldview, because in many ways we are better. To make a critical thinker helps us all better than just having another person check off my exact things, because in that case, if we have a new critical thinker, now we have actually two minds in the room. And instead of, if we all follow the same statement of political faith agreements, now we're just an avatar for that set of things. When we actually are critical thinkers, now we have what God designed as our brains and our souls working with now we have two minds in the room that can actually help promote new ideas and transformation versus just converting somebody to my set of beliefs. So when we get back, let's talk about sitting in meetings where you're hearing this stuff. You're part of this institution or this system or this education system or the Madison County teacher. You're a Madison County teacher and you are hearing all this stuff and, how to fight or how to handle it when the meetings and the protocols and the emails that go out have it all everywhere. Where to start there? Okay.
Yes.
When we get back with Dr. Jennifer Miller, let's pick up here. Let me set it up real quick this way. I didn't do a good job and I was in pharmaceutical sales. I got a target on my back real quick. The second year I was there, I made the highest sales honor of the company and everything was great. I was very arrogant, but from the beginning in these sales meetings, I would challenge the top down control. I didn't read the room well. I didn't like the TPS reports. I call them, like from Office Space. We had 8 different reports going to 8 different, bureaucratic people. And so I bring this up because of this reason. I can imagine if I'm sitting there as a teacher in a conference and they're spouting this critical theory, or I'm in a corporation and they're starting to do like they did Ken Wilson. They said, we're going to move so much of a percentage of minority people into the board by this date. I mean, that's absolute racism, systemic racism. How do you handle it? Number one, how do you feel like you're not propagating this worldview? And how do you, for lack of a better term, fight it from the inside?
Absolutely. So one of the things I would say is know your goal and know how much risk you can tolerate. Because depending upon the place that you're at, doing or not doing certain things brings about a certain amount of risk. And one of those risks is the attention, right, of the powers that be, because sometimes it's better to fly under the radar and focus your efforts in the classroom and kind of let the administration just sail on by, versus sometimes you may feel like, no, it's essential. It's important that I do, speak up, but just know that then turns the attention to you. So you kind of have to decide, what's my goal? Is my goal to go and try to bring about a change in the culture of the faculty, the staff, the administration? Or do I want to kind of fly under the radar on that side of things and instead see what I can accomplish in the classroom where, I have a lot more influence and a lot more say when it comes to how things are presented and how things are taught to the students directly? That
makes a lot of sense. And one aspect may be you need to be what we call the gray man, which is what you're describing. In military training, they're like, you don't want to be the lead, you don't want to be the fastest runner, you don't want to be the slowest runner, you want to be in the middle and the instructors not see you. So part of that would be, while you build your credibility, while you build your relationships even with the top dogs, you might need to be a little bit gray man at first and evaluate this risk, and then you'll have more ground to stand on year number 1 or 2, or as you get into this, or maybe if a bigger, more dangerous issue comes up. Great stuff.
Absolutely. And also, one of the first things I would tell any teachers is know your rights, but also know what you signed up for. So make sure that you read your contract very carefully, read your job description, know the faculty or staff handbook really well, know what the state laws and the federal laws are as far as what teachers, are allowed to do or not do, and realize that there's there's certain parameters that you need to operate in. But then sometimes you need to function in an even smaller kind of circle, because if you, for example, something came up at the university that I work out, and I had a choice to make that I, could go through the policy and go up the chain and bring my complaints all the way up to the provost. But I had to do a risk assessment and say, or the cost assessment, and go, okay, but then that's going to now put me on the radar of the provost. And that's going to also upset everybody that my complaint would potentially affect. Yeah. And so I had to sit here and weigh it and say, okay, can I tolerate this and let it go? Or, do I need to pursue it, knowing that I'm not making any friends doing it this way? So even though the policy's in the handbook, it's not like it's an easy process, and it may ultimately not be worth it, because then, it can bring about, like I said, attention as well as criticism, as well as, making enemies of people potentially.
Yeah. Okay. What about inside of the classroom, or say inside of a group that you have in a corporate level, you are over a few group, or you're a member of a particular project group, and how can you, and in particular, let's focus in on teaching. Mm-hmm. How can you defend, these individual rights and fight back against this critical theory and mm-hmm. cultural Marxism without, maybe give us some specifics or way to go about it? How would you teach an outright critical theory lesson that's on the lesson plan, but yet defang mm-hmm. it?
Yes,
maybe.
Absolutely. So I know that there are certain subjects within the school that you have certain standards you have to meet, or if you teach like an AP class, well, then there's certain things on a test that you have to prepare your students for. And so sometimes there is material or information you're required to present, but you're not required to present it in a certain way. Okay. So, for example, my son was in an AP government class, and he came home spouting off all of the criticisms of the Electoral College. And I looked at him and said, did you watch a Chuck Schumer speech? Right. I mean, like, this is Democrat talking points you're spouting off to me. And he said,
I remember you sending out that text chain.
Yeah. And so he said, no, my teacher taught it. And so I emailed the teacher and I said, can I come in and present the counter arguments? Because this is crazy that you're only giving criticisms and not at all addressing the beauty and brilliance of the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. And her response back to me was no, she declined my offer, but she hid behind the fact that it was an AP standard that she had to teach the students criticisms of the Electoral College. Oh, but when I have since spoken to the principal of that school and the superintendent, something I point out is, I understand she has to teach the criticism of the Electoral College, but nowhere does it limit her or prevent her from providing the counterpoints. Sure. So if I'm in that position and I'm a conservative teacher that has to teach criticisms, you better believe I'm going to be teaching the counterpoints, because I'd much rather have my students go into this test being able to address a question, say it's an essay question, arguing both sides, or presenting what the criticisms are, but then here's the answers, here's the counterpoints mm-hmm. to it. So basically being committed to developing critical thinkers, where I'm not now emulating and doing the same thing that those I'm criticizing are doing, but just to my ideology. That was always my commitment. I don't want to go in and indoctrinate people to my ideology, just like I don't want them doing the same to theirs. Mm-hmm. So instead, I'm going to go in and be committed to critical thinking and presenting both sides of the issue so that my students can then decide for themselves where they land on the subject.
By the way, that used to be education.
It used to be.
That used to be what we were doing. We were creating a whole bunch of critical thinkers. That way, if we had 100 people in a room, we had 100 functioning brains, not just people that were avatars of a certain ideology.
Absolutely.
And we were all better. I mean, you look at the engineering from the past and everything, and you see that, okay, this is a very key point I want to hone in on right here mm-hmm. for the next couple of minutes. Would you say that in most cases, even from the corporate world, if you're having to lay something out, or in particular, we're really focusing on teachers today, any case where if you were seeing like anything that could come up in critical theory in the curriculum, would you say most likely there's no catch that you can't say the opposite side almost? Now, you need to double check
that. Right.
Because that's a major, that there is an answer that I hadn't thought of that really will solve so much of this. So probably in every single aspect of what they're trying to get you to teach, which by the way, it's crazy that they would actually have written, you need to do criticisms of the Electoral College.
Right.
They almost always will probably not say you can't do the pros of this particular institution.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I've done in the classroom is if there's, say, student conversation happening, if it's all drifting into this monolithic, position, I try to do some Socratic methods where I'm going in and I'm asking questions and I'm getting them, I'm prompting them to go more nuanced. So let's not just sit here and talk in memes. Let's actually get more nuanced, right? One of the ways I'll do it is I'll ask them to all define their terms, or what do you mean by that? And then you can also have them play it out. So it's like, so if you're saying this is true in this situation, let's play it out. What does it hold true across situations? So getting them to, one, get more nuanced and also define their terms, but then at the same time play out the logic, and does your logic actually hold? So one of the things you can do, and again, this used to be education, right. Is teachers can teach about logical fallacies. And so just moving through and just saying, what are some logical fallacies? And then guess what? You can bring in examples. And that's another way that I have been able to balance out what the curriculum or the textbook may be presenting that I think is too extreme or is very much leftist, is I'll bring in other examples, or I will have them look at the textbook and use that as the example that we're now going to analyze for logical fallacies. Yeah.
Okay. I love this. So teaching logical fallacies inside of each and how to identify these logical fallacies, like for instance, the most popular ones perhaps would be false dichotomies.
Yes.
You're only presented with all control or complete anarchy or a destruction of the institution. There's no middle ground there. Teaching kids inside for each issue how to identify false dichotomies.
Absolutely.
False options, or focusing in on ad hominem attacks and being able to say,
and
look,
straw man arguments.
Right. And straw man arguments, and not falling in on saying just because, here's the thing. If not letting people be demonized as bad, and then just because they may be a bad person, which couldn't even be true, that nothing they're saying is true.
Right.
That's also not the case either.
Exactly.
This is great. And we'll land it here because the 2 hours went so quick, and I want to be able to come back with enough time where we can make sure we get in touch with you. And I want to talk about one thing about not indoctrinating our own kids as well. But let's leave it there. So we have totally, understand your job of what you're doing and what you signed up for legally.
Right.
And then also inside these issues, you're going to be charged with teaching a particular opinion of something that is building their big institution. And you're probably not, you can teach the opposite. You can teach the pros and cons, and then just focus in on the logical fallacies, and having a whole bunch of students that can pick logical fallacies. They will be ahead of the game, light years ahead of the game.
Absolutely.
And maybe, inoculated a little bit further from brainwashing. Our final segment with Dr. Jennifer Miller when we get back. From globalist and cultural Marxist propaganda. And you can get your daily dose right here in A Good Fight with Jameson Haygood on 103.9 WYAB. And sometimes we get situations like this where the real inoculation would come from Dr. Jennifer Miller and people in her field. And I'm not patronizing her, because I tell her when she don't even hear it, and I can run 100 people up here to identify it. She is literally a top tier scholar here in Mississippi that we have as a resource to defend against this whole collectivist takeover that comes from critical social theory and now has run rampant through every institution we have. We have 1 minute here. Let's remind once again, Jennifer Miller Ministries and ways that we can reach out to you and kind of what you're planning here this next year.
Absolutely. So, JenniferMillerMinistries.com. And something I don't know if I've shared with you, Jameson, that I'm stepping away from academia. So this is going to be my final semester. Okay. And instead I am going back into full-time ministry. And really what that's going to allow me to do is to pursue what I do in ministry, but also to continue to pursue this line of thinking and being able to advocate for truth within education and continue to have opportunities to speak on the political side as well.
So this is going to help you with the asymmetrical culture, spiritual and culture war.
Absolutely.
That is incredible. And to announce it here and to fill me in like that couldn't be a better end to this, because we bid you Godspeed. Thank you so much. We will have you on again.
Thank you.
There you go.